The sermon is kind of in three parts. The first two parts are very important because they set the scene for the third part, which is actually the punchline. I have to do these other two parts so that you get the punchline at the end. But isn't it crazy how, as we read Scripture and as we live our lives, that it is true that God has the most incredible way of turning up in the most unusual of places. We have God turning up in a cradle at Christmas time. How unusual that the God of heaven should become a baby born. That's very unusual. He turns up in the craziest, most unusual places. How crazy it is that God would be put upon a cross and that Jesus would be there. God has an ability or a tendency to turn up in the most unusual places. Well, in the Old Testament, one of the most unusual places is a story we've just told the kids. God turning up in a burning bush. Wow, trying to get Moses' attention out of 40 years of drudgery and miserable living, of dead space, as we said last week. And now, as he moves from dead space, we find Moses standing on holy ground. We do not decry the dead space period. We spoke about that last week. How that God used that dead space time to prepare Moses to get all of Egypt out of Moses so he was able to use him again. Now, I want you to turn, if you have your Bibles, to Exodus chapter 3. And let me read to you from the passage exactly what took place that day. It's actually a great conversation. They were eavesdropping in on here. Conversation that takes place between God and Moses at the burning bush. Chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flocks of Jethro, his father-in-law, and the priest of Midian. And he led the flocks to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and precious, spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now go, this is verse 10. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And here we have Moses returning his speech. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I say? Tell them. And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And then in chapter 4, Moses answered, What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, The Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, Reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake and turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that you may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, Put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was leprous, like snow. Now put it back into your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. And then in verse 10, Moses said to the Lord, "Oh Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech, I stutter," he's saying it, and tongue. And the Lord said to him, "Who gave man his mouth? Who gave him the deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." But Moses said, "Oh Lord, please send someone else to do it." Great conversation. Let me just put it up, the conversation from God's point of view, up on the board here. The first thing we read in verse 6, God declaring, not because he needed to introduce himself, Moses knew of God, but he says, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." He was identifying himself by saying that. "I have seen the misery of my people. I have heard their cry." Verse 7, "And I am concerned about them. And I have come down from heaven to them. And now I am sending you." This is the deal, people. This is the conversation that God had with Moses at that particular time. It begins with, let's just go through these very quickly. It begins with the God identifying himself. He didn't have to introduce himself. He's identifying himself by saying, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And the burning bush, I think, is a beautiful picture. Some preachers will preach about the picture of the burning bush and say it's a beautiful picture of who God is. He's on fire. And our God is a consuming fire. You don't want to get too close because it might burn you in His holiness and His righteousness. God is a consuming fire. He's not just a consuming fire, but He's a consuming fire that cannot be put out. It burns continually. He's a perfect picture of self-sustainability. Now the bush says it all. The purity and the holiness of God and His inability to be destroyed. Secondly, verse 7, this great God who is not able to be destroyed or could never run out or could never expire, who's continually, in a sense, on fire. He says, verse 7, I have seen. I have seen. It's always lovely to be seen, isn't it? The joy of being seen. Have you ever watched a kid at sports day? It's always so cool. The kid is looking in the crowd. He's looking for his significant other, maybe his mom or his dad or his sister or his friend. And he's waving, "Mom, Dad, sister, friend, I'm over here. Can you see me?" And when the parents watch, he doesn't care about the rest of the crowd. He's just so delighted that those he loves see him. There is joy and fulfillment in just being seen. There's a beautiful story in the Old Testament of a lady called Hagar. And she had run away from Sarai, her master, because she had fallen pregnant to Abram. And Sarai was jealous, and she made Hagar's life miserable and threatened her. Hagar ran into the desert with nowhere to go, and she found no water. She found nothing to eat, and she was slowly just wilting away, when all of a sudden she's sitting down at a well of all places. She finds herself, by God's providence, sitting at this well. And God says, Sarai, Hagar, this is what you need to do. Tells her what to do. And He gives her the very thing that she needs the most. And Hagar is totally overwhelmed that the God of creation, the God of majesty, the God of the universe, as she would have looked into the stars at night, the God of the desert, the God of this world, is the same God who sees her. Not as if He, like the song says, is watching from a distance, but there is nothing, people, that God does not see. And she was overjoyed. She gave Him the name El Roi, the God who sees. But not just the God who sees, the God who sees me. He sees me. And like that kid in the crowd before he runs his race or swims his race, is so delighted that my mom is watching me. gives a great sense of value. The third thing he says here, also in verse 7, it says, I have heard the cry of the people. Jesus is always hearing the cry of people. God has always heard the cry of people as they have cried out to him. Just have a look at the life of Jesus, and you have in Mark chapter 10, you have blind Bartimaeus. He's blind. He's been sitting at the city gates all this time. He hears that there's a healer in town. His name is Jesus. He senses the movement of a crowd around him, but he cannot see anything. And then somebody mentions the name Jesus, and he starts to cry out. He says, Jesus, Jesus, I'm over here. Jesus, come and heal me. Jesus, I am here, Jesus. And the crowd is saying, Bartimaeus, just be quiet. You have nothing to do with Jesus, and he has no time for you. You're just a blind beggar sitting at the street gate. Just be quiet. But Bartimaeus would not be quiet. He cried even louder, we read, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy upon me. I am right here. And then he hears the voice of Jesus saying, hey, blind Bartimaeus, I'm right in front of you. And the crowd is saying, you mean, Jesus, you heard his voice? And the crowd is screaming your name. It's your most popular time of your life. And people are following you. There's thousands of people. And you will hear the voice of a blind beggar. You see, God always hears. I love the fact, beautiful picture in Revelation chapter 8, verse 1, where it says this, and John in his vision says, and there was silence in heaven. Silence in heaven. You say, why would there be silence in heaven? Are the angels not singing anymore? What about the holy, holy, holy? No, God has said, quiet everybody, quiet, all of heaven, be silent. And then it describes this beautiful aroma that's coming up to God from the incense as being the prayers of his people. And God is saying, angels, be quiet. Seraphims, be quiet. All of heaven, be quiet, because my people are praying. They're crying out to me. And amidst all the worship, God is still listening for the cries of his people. In Numbers 11, we learn a lesson about crying out to God. We learn that we need to be really careful about what we cry out for, because we may just find that God gives us what we cry for. In Numbers chapter 11, the people were crying out for meat. They were tired of the beautiful manna that God laid the table with every day, that they woke up and there was manna on the floor. They were tired of that, and they wanted meat. So they cried out to God and said, okay, you want meat? I'll give you meat. And so God sent quail amongst them, and they were delighted at first. And they were grabbing these birds and killing them and cooking them and eating them. And God said, I'm going to give you so much for what you have cried for, that in the end you're going to hate this stuff. And you're going to eat so much that it's going to come out of your nostrils. I didn't say that. The word says that. And so the people got what they cried for, but in the end, it says, they loathed it. 1 meter, 3 feet full of quail as far as the eye could see. They got what they cried for. So be careful, just in case God gives you what you're crying for. Let me just say this, though. Crying out to God is a legitimate thing to do. Yesterday, as I was preparing, I got to the concordance and I had a look through how many times in the book of Psalms it says, Lord, give ear to my cry, or incline your ear toward me. And I found 20 references that the psalmist says of, Lord, won't you hear my cry? Lord, won't you incline your ear towards me and hear my case? So it's a legitimate cry. Do not be afraid to cry it, but be aware that God hears every cry from you. And then in verse 7, it goes on to say, I am concerned for you. God concerned for the children of Israel. God was concerned for people who had sinned, who had messed up, who had worshipped other idols, who had gone astray. And God is still concerned for his people. Indeed, he is. And the greatest question out there amongst so many people today is, does God really care for me? Certainly wouldn't look like it. My bank balance is low. My kids are sick. I've lost my job. You know, the rains haven't come. Does God really, really care for me? Well, Jesus answers that question in Matthew 10:29. He says, He cares for the sparrow that falls. If He cares for the sparrow that falls, how much more won't He care for you? And then 1 Peter 5 verse 7, Peter says, cast all your cares upon Him because He what? He cares for you. Sounded interesting. You know, when we often use the reference to the storm that the disciples went through that day or that night on the sea. But in the book of Mark, Peter, who was telling the story to Mark, who was just described, writing out the story, describes it from a different angle. He says this. He says, we went out to sea. The storm arose. Everybody agrees on that. And then we saw this figure, and we recognized that this figure was Jesus. Now, the other accounts are just so delighted that it's Jesus, and they're saying, Lord, don't you care for us? But Peter puts this little bit. He says, and Jesus made as if He was walking past us. And they would have cried out to Jesus in Peter's account, saying, hey, Jesus, don't leave us. Jesus, can't you see we're in the midst of this huge storm? Jesus, we're over here. Jesus, don't walk away from us. And it would have appeared that Jesus was walking away. Was He walking away? No, not at all. Was He passing by? No, He wasn't. It was just a test. Peter picked it up and said, disciples, don't be fooled. He's not walking away. He's just testing us to see if we will continue to trust Him in the midst of the storm. It's just a test. It would appear that He is moving past us. People, He's not. It's just a test. And in verse 8, He says, I have come down. I have come down. And you say, well, I thought God was everywhere. Why would God particularly have to come down? Is God an individual that He's not everywhere at one time? Of course He is. We know that to be true. But this denotes for us a real aspect of special attention at special times to certain people. Where God, in a sense, says, I am so absorbed with you. I am so with you. Your concerns are my concerns. I'm all consumed for your well-being. It's as if I am standing right in front of you. I have come down. Now, one of the greatest examples we have of this is Christmas, is it not? Where God became a man. And in a sense, He came down to earth for us. It's always a moving thing when you watch TV or read a good story about when royalty or high-ranking people go and connect with the local people. An act of condescension that they would leave their castle or their throne to come down amongst the ordinary folk. And we always get this good feeling that at a time of war, the king arrives to encourage the troops. At a time of deep sickness, the prime minister will arrive at somebody's bedside just to encourage them. You know, when we just so... When dignitaries come to schools and meet with kids, and we're asking, how do you feel when people see that kind of stuff? Well, ask those children, or those sick people, or those soldiers, and they will tell you they all feel incredibly valued when somebody condescends enough to come down to me and meet me at the level where I am. Well, people, listen. If we get excited about people who do that, how much more excited should we not be that God Himself, this great Creator, comes down to be with us? That should make you feel incredibly special and greatly valued. And then God comes back to an I am. He starts with an I am. In the middle, He has an I am. And then in the number 6 here, in verse 10, He says, I am now sending you. What we're saying here is this is where we pick up on our theme of standing in the gap. He's saying to Moses at the burning bush, Moses, I need, like last week Ezekiel will say, I need somebody to stand in the gap between the hurting people of Israel and Pharaoh, and I need them to join my hands with them and be able to deal with Pharaoh so that we can be connected. You've got to get Pharaoh to let my people go. Take the hand of the hurting. Take the hand of God. Moses, will you stand in the gap and join the two of us together? God could have done that Himself, but He always chooses to use people to stand in the gap. Now, in this series that I'm so excited about, you're going to see different people standing in the gap for different reasons. Nehemiah is standing in the gap because his heart is broken over the plight of the people in Jerusalem. We have Esther standing in the gap simply because it's the right thing to do. There are so many different reasons at different times that people are called to stand in the gap. But Moses is standing in the gap simply for, number one, because God told him to. God told him to. No emotion here. No broken heart here. No feeling it's the right thing to do it all. Moses stands in the gap simply because God said, Moses, I need you to do it. Now, God is always sending people. He's sending you. He said, when Isaiah came and saw the Lord was purified, and God said, who can I send? And Isaiah, who had been purified, puts up his hand and said, Lord, you can send me. And then we have in John chapter 10, verse 21, as the Father has sent me, Jesus says, so I send you. This continual theme of the sanctified being sent to do certain things. We have God in John 3, verse 17, where it says that God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but to bring the world back to Himself. God sends people all the time. There's always a purpose. Moses, I'm sending you to save Israel. Church, I'm sending you to save the world. When Jesus in Matthew 28 was with His disciples on the top of the mountain, He's about to ascend to heaven after His resurrection, leaves them with His final word, I am sending you into the world to save the world, to make disciples of all men, of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father. So I am sending you. People, as much as we are sanctified, we are sent as well. Sometimes we talk too much about our sanctimonious things that we forget that we are a sent people. We are saved not just to serve, but we are saved to be sent to save the world. Next phase. Moses now, after this, gets to respond to God after God had made His speech to Moses. Now, it started pretty well because Moses finds himself on his face in the presence of God. And he looks and he says, God, I'm on holy ground. There's only one thing you do on holy ground. There's no high fives with God. Hey, God, how you doing? Nice to see you today. How things in heaven? Nothing like that at all. Moses on holy ground, he hits the floor. No familiarity with God. I'm so scared of becoming familiar with God, especially when you stand on holy ground. And so he's on his face. That's a good place to start in your response to what God is saying when you're on holy ground. But then it's downhill from there on. Moses begins with his excuses. Who am I, he says, that you would want to send me? And the problem that he has over here, Moses' response is rife with problems. His first problem that he has is an identity problem. Who am I? Who am I? Now, if 40 years before this, Moses would have said, I'm ready to go. I'm all ready to go. I'm ready to go. I've done my training. I'm ready to go. And if you just give me the job, I'm well trained for it. I've been to university. I've studied military stuff. I know exactly what you want me to do. But now, after 40 years in the wilderness and everything he'd learned in Egypt is now gone, he says, man, 40 years ago, I could have killed for this. This would have been a great opportunity for me to prove myself. And yet now, 40 years later, he believes he has nothing to offer. See, his idea at that point was based upon who he thought he was. Never base your idea upon or your identification upon who you think you are. You need to base your identity upon who God thinks you are. And your identity is not who you are, but whose you are. And when you belong to God, you're a child of the King. You're a new creation in Christ. For goodness sake, people, behave like a new creation. Don't behave like that old person who's still battling with that old issues. I have a new identification founded in Christ. Your should not be based, your identification should not be based on what you have to say, but what God has to say. And when we begin, and we need to teach our teenagers this, and in fact, probably more than our teenagers, many of us need to understand we're not who the world says we are. We're not sometimes who our teacher says we are. Because there are some teachers who say stupid things and tell their children they're never going to amount to anything. Never do that, teacher, because that kid is going to believe you. You are his source of authority and you're his source of information. If you tell him he's a failure, for goodness sake, he's going to be a failure. So be careful what we say to our children. Be careful what we say to those around us, because their identification may well be founded upon what we say, and that's silly. Our identification be founded in what God says of us, to us, and about us. And that's always good. The second response is where he says, who are you? He's talking to God now. He says, who will I say has sent me? Number 2. And this was a problem of intimacy. You see, he knew about God. He knew a few things about God. He had heard about God, but he didn't really know God. And if he had known God, and we'll talk about this just now, he would have been in a completely different boat. You say, well, how do I know him? How do I get to know God? Well, one of the things that we all need to do is we need to read about him. We have a great book here. A great book. It talks about God from front to back, from beginning to end, teaching us so much about who God is, what he likes, what he doesn't like, who he is, and what he loves, what he doesn't like. We can read about a God who's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. We can read about a God and get to know a God who is gracious, who is kind, who is holy, who is just, who is righteous. We can read the book and find out about who this God is. But the fact is we can know a lot about him and still not know him. But we still have to begin here. We have to find out about him. And so here's an interesting thought for you. There are these things. Shani gave one just now to the kids. They call it a challenge. Now, apparently, on your Facebook thing that you guys do, is that some guy will come up with a challenge. And we'll send it out to people, and they've got to video themselves doing the challenge, just like Shanna did with the kids today. Well, apparently there was a challenge out there on Facebook of eating an egg, a raw egg. And someone sent this thing out to you people in the congregation, and John had told me about it, of eating a raw egg, and you had to have a cup of sugar and something else with this thing. And the challenge was eating the raw egg, eating sugar, and this other thing. And you people fell for it. Apparently everybody responded to this challenge. Jamie Stedman, you have to watch him. He doesn't have Facebook, he's like me, but Cheryl Stedman has it all over her Facebook page of Jamie eating this egg and then, puking. It's worth watching, I have to tell you. It's worth watching. So get on there. There are challenges. Well, I want to put a challenge out to you today. If they're doing it, why can't I? I want to challenge you to read the book of Nehemiah before next week. Because Nehemiah is going to be the focus of one who stood in the gap. Won't you read between this afternoon and next Sunday morning the book of Nehemiah? It's a great story, and I challenge you for that. I hope you'll respond to that challenge. Excuse number 3. What if they don't listen? And this is the problem that he had with intimidation. Intimidation is just another word for the source of fear. When we become intimidated by circumstances because they look bigger than us. Children of Israel were intimidated by Goliath because he appeared bigger than them. It's just an appearance. It may not be the truth. It's just an appearance. And intimidation leads us to a thing we call fear. And we become fearful. God can never use a fearful person. You know what the opposite of fear is, in my opinion? The opposite of fear is not faith. The opposite of fear is freedom. Because fear binds you. Fear gets around you. It inhibits you. It stops you from doing stuff. It makes you freeze. It makes you stand still. That's what fear does. And for fear to break from fear, we need to find a new source of freedom. And you're sitting there thinking, well, what happens if I fail? Or what happens if you succeed? Helene has a beautiful saying up in our house and said this, what if I fail? Oh, darling, but what if you succeed? What if I fail? Oh, darling, but what if I fly? Hey, how cool would that be? that we have to get away from this fear thing, and freedom is what every believer needs to have. Last week, we spoke about the man with the withered arm. And can you imagine on that day that Jesus said, "My man, stand up and stretch out your arm in front of everybody." And this man said, "Oh, what if I fail? People are going to laugh at me. I'm going to be the laughing stock of this town. It's going to be all over town. I'm going to be so embarrassed that I have to expose my inadequacy. I have to expose my withered arm." And he could have said, "I'd rather just stay here and shrivel up and die than stand up and be potentially embarrassed." But it's so great that his if I do this turns to, what if I don't do this thing? If I don't do this thing, I lose the chance of having my arm healed. I lose the chance of having a great story to tell to my kids of how my arm has been healed. And his what if I do was underwhelmed by his what if I don't, and he stood up and he stretched out his arm, and God honored it, and he was healed. But what happens if we do fail? Hey, I fail. What happens if we do fail? I don't know if you fail. But the righteous, it says, though the righteous stumble and fall 7 times, yet will I uphold them. So failure, people, is not final. It's okay, according to Moses' story, to ask God for a sign. If God asks you to do something, it's okay to ask for a sign. Moses didn't even ask for a sign, and God gave him 2. He gave him the sign of the stick of becoming a snake, and the hand that became leprous and then was healed again. God is willing to give you a sign. Gideon asked for a sign, so too can you. So feel free if you're feeling the unction that God is the compelling factor, that God is compelling you to do something. Say, "Lord, I just need to check this thing out to make sure that I'm doing what you want me to do. Can I just ask for a sign?" And God will say, "Hey, I did it for Moses. I did it for Gideon. Why wouldn't I do it for you?" And so if you're feeling a little bit nervous, don't be afraid to ask for a sign. Excuse number 4 from Moses was, "Lord, I can't speak well." And his problem here was the problem of a supposed inadequacy. Lord, I can't do that. You want me to talk to Pharaoh? I haven't talked to anybody in years. I've been sitting in the desert for 40 years. I haven't spoken to anybody. The closest I get is speaking to my father-in-law, my wife, and maybe a few people at home. But most of the time I spend in the desert. I eat here, sleep here, I live here. I talk to sheep if I have to. But Lord, I haven't spoken to another human being for so long. Never mind, Pharaoh. How am I going to do this? I feel so inadequate. Well, some years later, a man by the name of Jeremiah felt the same way. And he was a prophet that God had said, from a young man, you will talk to the people. And he said, "Lord, I don't know how to speak. I don't know what I'm going to say." And God gave to him the same encouragement that he gave to Moses. He said, "I'll put the words in your mouth." He said to Moses, "Did I not make your mouth? Did I not put that tongue in your mouth? If I made your mouth, put the tongue in your mouth, am I not able, therefore, to give you the words to use that mouth and that tongue for?" Moses, I'll be with you. I'll trust you. You trust me. And we're going to get on fine. I will give you the words. Now, if I had time, I could share a personal testimony from you on this. When we were first called into the ministry, Mike was my senior pastor, Mike Rudder, and I was the youth pastor. And I just said to Mike, I love doing what I'm doing. Love working with kids. Love working with teenagers. I love telling stories to children. But Mike, I can't talk to adults. Don't ever ask me to preach. Well, he was a beautiful elderly man in the church. His name was Uncle Arthur. Everybody loved Uncle Arthur. He was a gracious, kind man. And he one day came to me and he said, "Hey, Trevor, when are you going to preach in the church?" I said, "No, Uncle Arthur, never, probably." He said, "Oh, don't be silly. Why?" I said, "Well, Uncle Arthur, I can't talk to adults. And I've got in my job description here that I don't ever have to talk to adults because I just want to talk to kids." And Uncle Arthur said, "Oh, get over it. You're preaching next week." And I preached the next week. He pushed me into the pulpit. I haven't been able to get out of the pulpit since then because I went to God and I said the same thing. "God, I can't do this." I didn't sleep for days before I had to preach. I was so nervous. I was a gibbering idiot before I had to stand in the pulpit. And even now, you won't believe this. You won't understand the dilemma I feel before I preach. I'm pacing the floor. My heart is pounding, and I don't sleep well at night because I'm still so nervous to speak in public. But God has said, it's okay. In fact, that's good, because now you'll trust me and not yourself. And that's what God was saying to a far greater extent, with far greater significances, to Moses and to Jeremiah, and to a much lesser extent me. The fifth excuse was, I know you can find somebody else. Lord, if I could just deflect this to somebody else, and the feelings of inferiority were incredible. Lord, I can't do this. This is a big job, Lord. You want me to go? I can't do that. And he argued, and he won the argument. And it says God was angry with Moses. He said, okay, if you're not going to do it, I will succumb to give you Aaron to go with you. It was not God's first prize. Now listen to this. Aaron to Moses was nothing but a pain in the neck his entire time in the wilderness desert. Aaron led the people into idolatry with the golden calf. Aaron was the one who got jealous of Moses from time to time. Aaron got the people into a lot of... It should have just been Moses. Moses on his own would be fine. You see, because when you've got Moses and God, you have a majority. When you have Moses, Aaron, and God, you've got a problem, because you've got a third-party experience going on over here. And so Moses felt totally inferior, caused a lot of pain. Okay, so we said Moses' responses were all, John Maxwell gives us these things of identity, a problem of intimacy, intimidation, inadequacy, and inferiority. Okay, here's the punchline. I did all of that for this. Listen carefully. All that Moses did wrong, according to this list, was he got the order wrong. You see, if Moses had started with intimacy of knowing God, all of these other things would have fallen away. If he had just started by saying, Lord, I want to know you. I don't just want to know of you or I know about you. I want to know you personally. When you know God personally, when you know God well, and the Bible has great terms like one who walks with God as you walk with a friend. When you walk with God like you are a friend, identity goes. Intimidation is a non-entity. Inadequacy falls away, and inferiority is so far away from you. If you get number 2 right, the rest will automatically fall. You say, well, all of this for that? How do we know God? Well, there's 3 ways we get to know God. First one was I told you just now. Let's read about Him. Let's get some knowledge about Him. But even though you have knowledge, doesn't mean you know Him. You just have knowledge about Him. Secondly, not do we just read about Him, but we need to reflect on Him as well. And thirdly, we need to use retrospect to understand and to know God better. When you look back over your life and you see who God is and what He has done, it's incredible. Have a look at examples like David. David in reflection, he looks back in retrospect and he said, I've never seen the righteous forsaken, and I've never seen their seed begging for bread. I've seen the strangest thing, because I have observed God over the course of many years. I have observed Him. And then you have someone like Elisha. Love Elisha. And Elisha knew God because he had experienced God over a great period of time. How's this? Go and read this in 2 Kings chapter 6. Elisha is in the city of Dothan, and he's surrounded. His servant comes, says, Elisha, we're in trouble. Elisha says, we're never in trouble. Greater is He who is with us than he who is on the outside of the wall. And we see a great man of faith making a great statement of faith. But did it start there? No, it didn't. Chapter 2, that was chapter 6. In chapter 2, we have the mantle where he took Elijah's mantle and he struck the water. And he said, where now is the God of Elijah? And the water parted. Thus began his supernatural experiences with God. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3, he has the valley of ditches where he says to the king, dig a valley full of ditches, and God filled those with water miraculously. In chapter 4, we have the story of the widow with a little bit of oil, and Elisha comes and says, go and get all the jars you can from your friends, and overnight those jars are filled supernaturally. We have the story in chapter 4 of the Shunammite woman and the poisonous stew. And then chapter 5, we have the story of Naaman being healed of leprosy. I think what this guy was looking back in retrospect, he says, I don't just know about God. I just don't know that God can do all those things. That's not all I know. That God is a miracle working, but I have personally experienced these things. And I now know Him. Do we know God? Well, how do we know that we know God? Well, there's one thing that all these great men have in common. Listen, people, to this. You can tell if you know God by how well you manage the storms of life. Every one of these people had its tested of their knowingness of God. And whenever they were faced with an incredible crisis, or they were faced with something that would be perceived or would be deemed to be impossible, they didn't even raise a pulse. You see, they knew God was going to take care of this. And you can tell people in this world who know God because they don't panic and don't stress about stuff, no matter how big it is. They know God. And when I know God, none of that matters. When I know God, I know He knows me. I know He'll provide for me. I know He'll care for me. And I just don't know those things about Him. I know Him. My kids and my wife know me. They know that I'm going to do the best I can to provide for them. They know me. They know me. And when we know God like that, then our pulse will not even race. When crisis happens or things happen in our lives, because we don't just know about Him, we just know of Him. We don't know of Him. We know Him personally, because we, over the course of many years, have experienced the wonder of God. At the close of Moses' life, it's an amazing thing. Deuteronomy is a great book. It's basically 3 sermons that Moses preached at the end of his life. And they were reminiscing sermons. They were sermons that were looking back in retrospect at what they'd learned about God. And in chapter 32, at the end of Moses' life, God comes to Moses and said, okay, Moses, the curtain is about to close now. You are soon to die. What I want you to do, Moses, after you've done all this retrospective journey in your sermons to your people, is I want you to go to Mount Nebo. And Moses would have said, Lord, what's going to happen at Mount Nebo? And God said, on Mount Nebo, you're going to die. And we read almost that there must have been a smile on his face. He said, Lord, how cool is that? That I've lived out my years. I have been the one who stood in the gap. I've taken the hand of the hurting children of Israel, and I've taken your hand and I've joined them together. Lord, now I can go home. I know you. I know you. And I can't wait to see you face to face. Moses knew God. The people knew the law, but Moses knew the lawgiver. The people experienced His provision, but Moses knew the provider. They had experienced His redemption, but Moses knew the Redeemer. So, I close with this. To us, what does knowing God look like to us? Let me give you a few examples. I could probably go on for an hour, but I won't. Knowing God looks like the little herdsman in the middle of the Transkei who knows that God loves him and provides for him. But he's been through a tough time, and the herdsman knows God is going to, Nkulu is going to provide for me. And I will smile, even if He doesn't. Knowing God is like that teacher who takes teaching to one thing, but being a role model to another. Of loving kids, even those kids that are not always that lovable. Loving kids. And the kid looking to my teacher, and the teacher taking Jesus to the people. That's how you know that teacher loves God. What about knowing God looks like that single parent who has to get up every day and care for little children with no help? Maybe the occasional phone call from somebody. But that single parent who has to get up and be mom and dad to these children and then get out of bed and go and work and earn and, oh man. And yet they love God. And they read and they pray with their children. That person knows God when they do that. What about that elderly couple who sit at mealtime and they hold hands and they pray and they thank God for their lives? And they pray for their children. And then they eat their food with gratitude. Those people, they know God. What about the doctor who goes the extra mile with his patients? The doctor who genuinely cares for them. They're not just human bodies, they're human beings. And that doctor who cares like that and takes Jesus like that man knows God when he lives like that. What about the nurse who cares and mops brows and shares in compassion with people who are suffering? What about the mother who at night sits praying for a sick child? Praying for salvation for that kid. When a mom does that, you know that mom knows God. What about that missionary out there in the field? And it's tough out there. Continuing to love people over years of what appear to be tough ministry. And they haven't become cynical. They haven't become entitled. They're still loving the people as if it was the first day that they were there. Those people, they know God. What about that parent who's lost a child? And they understand the pain. Wow, the pain. When you lose your child. And they weep at night. They can't sleep. Their mind is continually on the child that they no longer have. They can't talk about their child anymore because people are tired of them talking about their child, and yet they continue to brave on boldly and take Jesus lovingly to people by caring for other people who have lost children. When people do that, they know God. They don't just know about Him. They know Him. What about that donor who sits out there who has some means, and he, with a smile, he writes a check and he gives to people without his name having to be put in lights, and he smiles when he knows that this finance is going to be a blessing to the church or to some people who need this finance, and they do it with so much grace and kindness. And people, they know God when they do that kind of stuff. What about the police officer who's got a tough job and he's out there, and when he visits these scenes of tragedy and sadness, he takes Jesus into that situation? That person knows God. What about the NGO employee who goes every day to work to love people even though he gets paid a minimum wage? What about the gogo who lives out there caring for her children and her children's children because she wants to give Jesus to them? That gogo knows God when she does that for that reason. What about that pastor who every week gets up and has to preach something fresh and new to his congregations? They don't give him a hard time. And what about the pastor whose church is getting smaller rather than larger because some people are going to the church that's more jazzed up down the road or more comfortable down the road? And that pastor, when he just keeps preaching to 20 people as if he's preaching to 2,000 people, that preacher knows God when he can do that. What about that young person who has to face incredible peer pressure? When he knows God or she knows God, they have to stand alone. Man, I look at these teenagers today and I just so respect them for their ability, those Christian kids who know God. They don't just know about Him from Sunday school, which is great, but they know Him personally. And they stand against the prevailing wisdom of the teenage generation. And they stand alone, but they know God. So it's okay. What about the businessman? And he takes God into his business meetings. He acts with integrity. He's generous in the way he looks after his staff. The farmer who looks to God for his produce. But even then he cares for his staff and he looks after those who are poor and work for them. Oh man. What about Moses? Battle-hardened veteran of many spiritual battles and physical ones. At the end, he dies at the age of 120 and says, and Moses was as strong on the day he died as it was the day he went into the wilderness. Hadn't aged at all. He was still passionate about why he was called. He was not bitter. He was not cynical. He had seen so many ups and downs. And here he is, at the age of 120, still taking the hand of God, hand of the people, joining them together. And now it's time for him to go. People, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. I think God says the same stuff to you. I am God, I've seen, I've heard, I've concerned, I've come down, I'm standing. And the question we have is, what is your response? I have to tell you that your response is your responsibility. You know that little cliche, I'm sure. And I hope that as you contemplate the sermon, that you'll find yourself in an intimate relationship with God when you really can say, I don't just know of Him, I don't just know about Him, but I really know Him. I hope that be your experience. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that we can know you, that we can read about you, we can reflect on you, that we can think in our minds about how great you are. And that is all great. But the greatest way of knowing you is to look back over our lives and to see what you have done, to celebrate your faithfulness, your goodness, your discipline, your amazing goodness toward us. As we look back, we are so assured that we know you because we have experienced you, not just because we know about you, but we have experienced you. We have a track record of your faithfulness and your goodness. And we now say, I know God. I can walk with Him and know exactly how God is going to respond because I know Him that well. I can talk with Him and know exactly what's on His heart because I know Him that well. Lord, I pray today we be a congregation like that and a church like that as well. In Jesus' name we pray.